Welcome, everyone. This is my guide to terrestrialization. So, during this quote unquote lecture, I will be going over some of the things I keep in mind with Terra, and stuff that I think you should be prepared for, and stuff like that. Uh, we'll say, disclaimer, I am not an actual professor or anything like that. So, this may get chaotic. This is also mostly done unscripted with just like a few notes for myself. So, if I get off track at any point, just let me know. So, some of the things that I want to go over during the lecture is what makes a good Tera-captain and analyzing what brings value to specifically Terra on certain Pokemon, um, and seeing like why do certain Pokemon perform better, why do certain Pokemon perform not as good, and why may some Pokemon that used to be good not be nearly as good anymore. Um, the second point that I want to go over is maximizing the value while drafting for Terra. I see something that a lot of people tend to do is they tend to just pick two very good Terramons, which might not complement each other very well, which can cause issues in that regard for your draft. Now, how do you decide your Terra type? This is just looking at a matchup uh, and going over, okay, what do I consider when deciding my Terra type, and maybe that can help you in your matches to prep your own Terra, or especially tougher matchups, hopefully. And then deducing your opponent's Terra type uh, during prep is this one specifically, as I think it's important to keep in mind what Terra types your opponent can bring, which are good, um, so that you limit the amount of options that you have to prepare yourself for. I think that is personally very important. Uh, and then how to prep for these opposing Tera-captains is obviously very important as well, making sure that you know how to deal with certain specific Terra Pokemon and certain archetypes and stuff like that. And then lastly, I want to go over a little section of deducing Tera-types in game. Obviously, that won't be relevant for this season, as this season we'll be using Terra Preview, which will tell you the Tera-type of the Tera-captains before the game. But for leagues that might not use that system, I think it's important to quickly go over just so that you know how to um, look at stuff like that while you're in game as well. So let's start off. What makes a good Terra Captain? Now, I think there is a good amount of faucets to what makes a good Terra Captain, but let's start with the basics. Terra, in its just like base, is a way for offensive Pokemon to get extra coverage, get extra power, uh, or for setup Pokemon that tend to be offensive, obviously, to get a free turn to set up. Now, there's also defensive benefits. Like I said, you can get that one turn to set up, uh, which then can allow you to run away with the game, for example. Um, Or if your Pokemon has a bad natural defensive typing, with a good example being Baxcalibur before it was massively banned everywhere. That has a pretty bad defensive typing. Giving it Terra gives it the same good offensive stab types of Dragon and Ice, while taking away a lot of the weaknesses that Baxcalibur has. Now, for Breakers as well, Breakers really, really like offensive benefits from Terra. They don't really care about the defensive ones. For example, take a Palafin, which again has been banned, but a Palafin is going to enjoy something like a Terra Grass to take grass hits much less than just going Terra Water and clicking a Wave Crash over and over again, or clicking Jet Punch over and over again. Pokemon like that, Enamorus being another good example, want to just click their stab over and over and over and over again. That is something that is very important for these breaker type Pokemon. Now, something else that is important for a lot of Terra Pokemon is versatility, obviously. as having multiple set options make for a good Terra Pokemon. Again, Enamorus is a great example because Enamorus can run Choice Specs Terra Fairy or even Scarf Terra Fairy to just spam Fairy type moves over and over, which you can also run a Calm Mindset. With a defensive Terra type, run Draining Kiss, you're hard to take down, and you can give yourself health back through Draining Kiss as well. You can run something like Superpower and give yourself setup over and over again, while again going for a defensive Terra type or for fighting Tera-type for coverage, or to make your superpower stronger. So that because of that, Enamorus is a good Tera-captain. It has a lot of versatility. It has a lot of set variety. So that makes it very good. Now, as for redundancy, Meowscarada is a very good example. Meowscarada isn't necessarily a bad Terra Captain. Spamming something like Overgrow boosted Terra Grass Flower Trick is very strong. But in a lot of matchups, Meowscarada wants Protein. And if you Terra, you can no longer change your type with Protein. So there's a bit of redundancy there. You want to change your type, but you're not able to because you've Terra'd. This makes Meowscarada not as good of a like Terra Captain. And you can also apply this to um, multiple Terra Captains in a sense. So, for example, say you draft Terra Ursaluna. Ursaluna with Terra usually either wants to be a breaker, just hit really hard with stab Terra types, or you can make it a bulky setup mon with moves that like bulk up and then a defensive Terra type such as Fairy or Water or something like that. However, if you then draft Iron Hands as your second Terra captain, then you kind of have two mons that want to do the same thing. They either want to break with their stab Terra types or gain extra coverage because of that, and break with that, or they want to sit there, be fat, and set up. Neither of them is very fast. They do kind of the same thing, which again is redundant to have. Now, there's also a difference between fast-paced Pokemon versus slow-paced Pokemon with Terra. Fast-paced Pokemon are generally better with Terra nowadays, as people know that if they get a few free turns for the other Pokemon to set up, they can handle it. So, for example, Salamence is a really good example of a fast-paced Terra Pokemon. It gets the one Dragon Dance, and it can run away with the game. Or through Moxie, or by getting a good opportunity with Intimidate. Sometimes you can even get two Dragon Dances, but generally one Dragon Dance is most that you will need. Quaquaval is another great example. You click Aqua Step, you get your boost. From here, you might need a Swords Dance, if even. Quaquaval is very strong already, so by attacking, it starts both breaking and making progress for you. So because of that, Quaquaval is a great example of a faster paced Terra Captain. Now, examples of more slower paced Terra Captains are, for example, Espathra. Espathra used to be viewed as very broken, but because of how long it takes to actually get Espathra to a winning position even after tearing it, it becomes quite easy to deal with, as it will need like 3 turns, 4 turns to get to enough boosts to actually start snowballing through a team. If you allow it those 3 or 4 free turns, it can be very threatening. But I think that is something that through playing more, you will have to get out of your system naturally. Now, there's also obviously an opportunity cost to being a Terra Captain. For example, I mentioned Quaquaval as a good fast-paced Terra Captain, but Quaquaval already has a really good natural typing of Water and Fighting. Water and Fighting is good defensively into Pokemon like Chien-Pao and Chi-Yu, which make it a valuable typing. So a lot of the time, you don't actually need or want to Terra Quaquaval, but it can be very good. So there is an opportunity cost to that, like I mentioned. Now, something that is good with Pokemon like that is if you have alternative Tera-captains, because then a Pokemon with a lower uh, opportunity cost can be Terra'd more often, while uh, something with a I lost my train of thought for a second, but if you have Quackball as like a somewhat higher opportunity cost Tera-captain, it's good to have a lower opportunity cost Tera-captain alongside that, as you can then more often than not Terra the lower opportunity cost Tera-captain than the Quackball, because the Quackball doesn't need it nearly as much. I'll get to your question in a second, by the way, Bird. I just want to make sure I've gone over everything that I want to go over for this. Um, so something I forgot to mention about setup as well is for me, setup Tera-captains generally require both offensive and defensive benefits. I think the Baxcalibur example from earlier that I used for the defensive benefits makes a lot of sense here. Baxcalibur can gain extra coverage or more power to its coverage, or even more power to its stabs, which are offensive benefits, which allow it to break through certain mons uh, after Terra. But like I said, Baxcalibur also just doesn't have a very good defensive typing, and thus it really likes having the ability to switch types to something that has more resistances or is not as threatened by its checks, stuff like that. Quackball again is a good example of this. In terms of offensive benefits, Quackball does not have a lot of coverage, so being able to get more coverage or more power on your stab so you don't need the coverage can be very valuable. And getting a free turn to where you can sword stance on like a switch and then aqua step, that is very valuable with Quackball. So the Bird asks, what is the minimum speed you'd be looking for in a faster Tera-captain? I think that depends. So it depends on the role that your own Tera-captain uh, essentially needs to fulfill. So, for example, if we take Quackball, for example, that is a good setup Tera-captain, obviously. It is on the faster side, while having a fairly middling speed stat, but it does boost with Aqua Step, obviously, so it doesn't need to be nearly as fast. Meanwhile, Salamence, again, it kind of has a middling speed stat this gen at 100, but it's still good because it can Dragon Dance. Even then, something like Enamorus, again, 106 is not that good, but just because of its raw power, it is still very good. I think a lot of faster Pokemon don't actually make for that great of Tera-captains unless it's something like Chien-Pao, which shouldn't be allowed in most cases, obviously. Um, and that's mainly because if you take something like Weavile, for example, if Weavile is going to be your Revenger, you are going to want stuff to be low and in range of Weavile anyway, and you're going to want to get it into that range. For the most part, Weavile is not going to OHKO a lot of mons, so getting Pokemon in range for Weavile to then revenge them is very reasonable. Getting an extra coverage for that can be nice, but generally it's not nearly as cost efficient as just getting a really strong Tera-captain that can break better for the Weavile, and then getting stuff in the range of Weavile faster. So, as I said, it depends, but there's no real minimum speed that I'd be looking for in a faster Tera-captain. So, maximizing value while drafting. I think some important things to keep in mind while drafting your Tera-captains is one, the diversity of your Tera-captains. As an example, if you have, for example, a Salamence and then a Flygon as like a lower tier Tera-captain, they want to do the same thing in a game, which generally is not great because if you have two mons that just want to click Dragon Dance for one turn and then try and sweep, they don't add any value to it. Meanwhile, if you have, say, a Salamence and a Cerulege, while they're both physical setup threats, Salamence pressures different mons than Ceruledge does. Salamence is threatened by fairies. Ceruledge can come in on fairies and make use of those to try and get a setup, and then snowball from there. Now, overlap doesn't have to be bad. Overlap can actually be very good. So, for example, if you have a Terra Sneasler and a Grey Tusk, both of those are very strong fighting types that, in right scenarios, can just click their fighting stab over and over. It's not bad to then have a Terra Sneasler alongside your Grey Tusk to just spam fighting moves. You'll overwhelm checks, which can be a very good thing. Now, personally, um, I think that there's a big difference in certain combinations that you can do, especially with the type of Terra format that we have. And that is, you can have a very high point Tera-captain alongside a very low point Tera-captain, or you can have like two middling ones. Generally, my philosophy is that one of your Pokemon is likely going to be more supported by your team. So investing in a higher point Tera-captain is generally more valuable. For example, if you have a team that is mostly built around King Gambit, and that is your Tera-captain, that will be infinitely more valuable than having a team that is mostly built around, say, Terra Skeledirge, and having Garganackle as a secondary Tera-captain, for example. Because the Garganackle is not going to be supported nearly as well by your team overall, while the Skeledirge might be, but the difference between Skeledirge and King Gambit is very big. So there's obviously also Teraband Pokemon such as Chien-Pao, Iron Valley, and stuff like that. How do they fit into the value while drafting for Tera-captains? So, say you get a Chien-Pao round 1, how do you then take that into account for people that get King Gambit or Sneasler or Enamorus or one of the other really broken Tera-captains uh, in the draft? And I think what you can do in these types of scenarios is shoot for those more like middle tier Tera-captains, such as, for example, Ceruledge, which is a very potent one, or Salamence, which is also a very potent one, that people will not draft in round 1 or round 2 generally, as they're still very valuable, but you have also, with Chien-Pao as the specific example, gotten probably the best mon that doesn't need Terra, right? So elevating the value of like your more middle picks to make them into top picks is very useful with especially Teraband Pokemon. So, uh, like I already alluded to a little bit, you want to enable your Tera-captains as much as possible. So, the thing with that is that if you have a setup threat Terra Pokemon, such as Salamence, for example, you want to have ways to make sure that you can make terraing as easy as possible for yourself. So, what I mean by that is if you draft, say, spikes and stealth rocks with various Pokemon that can use them, that'll generally be better, as you can chip down the checks to Salamence through that means, and then free up your Tera-type for other uses than having to break the checks to Salamence. For example, say your opponent has a Screamtail, and you have a Salamence. If you have to Terra into Steel to break the Screamtail, that is, to me, less valuable than having one or two really good spikers that can continuously chip down the Screamtail every time it comes in, unless it's like a Wish Protect set, at which point it's more passive, it forces certain prep from them, which should allow your Salamence an easier time to get through the other team. Now, the other thing you want to do is you want to deter checks and counters, and I think a good example for this is King Gambit. Now, King Gambit, and we'll go over this in a later section. falls kind of under the archetype of slow, bulky setup, like Tera-captains, such as like Ursaluna can be, or Iron Hands can be. King Gambit is probably the best at this, but that does mean that it has specific checks. For example, King Gambit really, really wants to not have a lot of chips, so it can take hits repeatedly, so it allows itself to get 50-50s wrong. That's the strength of King Gambit. If you get a 50-50 wrong on King Gambit, that's tough. But if you allow yourself to get a few of them wrong, at that point, the numbers game will eventually go into your favor over the course of a game, obviously. Because the odds of you getting several 50-50s wrong in a row is obviously you getting one 50-50 wrong. So, how how do you deter the checks and counters for King Gambit? And what are the checks and counters for some of these Pokemon? That is important to recognize. And in the example of King Gambit, a big check to it is, for example, spikes, as I said. So having some hazard removal at least to help with King Gambit, very good. Another big check to King Gambit is Encore. Being able to Encore it into a move that it doesn't want to lock into. For example, you still have a fighting type alive, you Encore it into Kowtow Cleave, and then suddenly it has a really tough time trying to win the game when it's the last Pokemon alive, obviously. So I think keeping that in mind while drafting already and having mons that can abuse that. For example, in this scenario, you have something that can switch in on more passive Encore mons. That's already great. So, how do you decide your Tera type? Now, the things I look at in a matchup are what are the likely checks to my Tera Pokemon, and how do I want to get past them? What are the offensive benefits I would like to get out of my Tera type? What will they revenge my Pokemon with? Or what will they try and break my Pokemon with in the case of more defensive Tera-captains? And what are the defensive benefits I'm looking for? And lastly, I try to look out for status. So, especially on setup mons, especially on mons that try and DD or rely on their speed to win the game, being Thunder Waved is obviously a very, very big threat. So, Ground and Electric are usually ones that I always tend to consider for that reason. Now, I actually have a matchup that I played fairly recently here to highlight what I mean. So, for this matchup, uh, my main win con was always going to be Cerulite. I already had that in mind before I played the game. 9 times out of 10, I was tearing this Cerulite. Because if I looked at his team, Shadow Sneak looked very powerful when you consider Dugtrio is one of the few mons that outspeeds me. Cerulege can obviously threaten that. Ogerpon is another mon that outspeeds me, but if it tears itself, then it obviously can't hit me with Ivy Cudgel due to Flash Fire. And if it doesn't tear itself, uh, grass moves are not very strong against fire moves as well, and won't do a lot of damage. Knockoff is threatening, but if I Terra, I will remove that weakness. It's good into Terrapagos before Terra even. Terra Starstorm will not be able to hit me, which is very good. Rotom is looking to be the likely check here. Sylveon, I resist. Orthworm doesn't look like a threat. Monkey Dory can get Shadow Sneaked and die. Deoxys is obviously weak to Ghost. Golurk is weak to Ghost. And then Cloyster looks somewhat annoying for Cerulege as well. So, some things that I find important here are Cerulege's speed, as I want to be able to outspeed mons such as Sylveon to not be hit by a Hyper Voice, for example, after I Terra, or Cloyster, which, if it outspeeds me, it can do a lot of damage as well, and stuff like that. Alright, excuse me for that. Um, so, I was at Cloyster, so I find it important to outspeed Cloyster, I find it important to outspeed Sylveon, I find it important to outspeed offensive variants of Golurk. So for those, my speed is important, so that's something I always consider. Now, as I mentioned, the checks to my Cerulege are Cloister and Rotom Wash. Cloister obviously being a Tera-captain, so I take its typing into consideration less. So the main thing I am looking at is a Rotom Wash. How can I get past this Rotom Wash with my Cerulege, and what threatens it? So I'm threatened by Hydro Pump. Cerulege already has a relatively good natural bulk, and especially Spadef already. So Hydro Pump doesn't seem like the biggest deal to me. Foul Play is obviously super effective, but if I Terra and potentially into a type that's not weak to a Foul Play, or if I use bulk up sets, I can get past Foul Play as well. So then what threatens me is Thunder Wave. Thunder Wave is a big threat for my Cerulege. Like I said, I really do like its speed here. And I don't feel like I need any extra coverage or any extra power because I can just set up for the power instead. So I decided to go for Terra Electric Cerulege here. Now, what actually threatens me with Terra Electric? It would be Golurk, which I should be faster than. I'm super effective against, so this one does not matter that much to me. And then we have Dugtrio, which is not very defensive. It's very much a glass cannon. And Shadow Sneak, after boost, should do a lot of damage as well. So at that point, I'm not actually afraid of any of the Pokemon that I see here with Terra Electric, so I decided on Terra Electric Cerulege for this matchup, which ended up working out very well. So, deducing your opponent's Terra type, the way I like to do it is think of what is the worst case scenario, what do I find likely, and what do I find unlikely as types, and I also try and look at it as if the matchup is reversed. So if we hold on, I wanna go back to this slide. There we go. So if we look at this matchup again, and then we go from my opponent's point of view, what is there to stop the Cloister from flicking Shell Smash and sweeping? Now, for physical sets, it's gonna be a likely Skarmory, because Skarmory can actually take the hits from Cloister and has Sturdy as well. Then it can send out Cloister with Whirlwind, stuff like that. So Skarmory is actually annoying for it, and Lantern's actually annoying for it, because I resist all its stabs, likely has to carry Drill Run, but if I run something like Shuka, Cloister has a tough time getting through. Now, another thing that Cloister would have to take into account is Iron Valiant. Vacuum Wave is a very strong priority move coming off of Iron Valiant stats, so taking that into account is also something important for this Cloister. So for the rest, Ice Move, Ice Move, Ice Move, Water Move, Ice Move covers pretty much everything. That is not the three I mentioned that can either outspeed in the case of Vacuum Wave or don't instantly get KO'd. So it probably wants to cover for something for those three. If it wants something that resists Vacuum Wave, it has to go for either Psychic, Ghost, Flying, or like Bug, stuff like that. None of those types really look that good, so I think it'll go into a neutral typing for the Iron Valiant, which um, would obviously be anything that's not weak to it, but it would probably be more leaning towards looking at Lantern and Skarmory and seeing, okay, how can I get through those? Now, like I already mentioned, you can do ground to try and cover for the Lantern. Doesn't cover nearly as well for the Skarmory. Can go grass to try and cover for the Lantern. Again, does not cover nearly as well for the Skarmory. Something you can do, however, is Terra Electric in this case, which helps you get through the Skarmory, whilst also resisting all of Lantern's electric moves and stopping the Thunder Wave, which can be very good. Lantern will still have Scald as its access to try and stop you, but something like Special Cloister with like Drill Run can still probably get through the Lantern. So I think Terra Electric for me would be the worst case scenario. and that's the one I focus on the most. I do consider stuff like Terra Grass for Lantern or to wall Ogre Pawns, stuff like that, but I keep that more in the back of my mind. I more so consider the worst case scenario option, try and prepare as best as I can for that one, and then go based off of that. Because realistically, if you are prepared for the worst case scenario, all the other scenarios should be easier to handle for you. Even if you have less tools, you should be more able to handle with that because you can deal with the worst case scenario already. So, how to prep for opposing Tera-captains. Already did go over that a little bit with the worst case scenario, but if you prep more so for that worst case scenario, obviously, then you should be fine. Now, the main thing about prepping for Terra is that you want to deny value out of the Terra. So, in the example with Cloister, if I can whirlwind with my Skarmory, so by keeping Skarmory at full health and keeping Sturdy active, I can whirlwind the Cloister, make sure that it does not get its White Herb from Shelf Smashing, force it to take Hazard Chip, denied value, denied opportunity to set up again. At that point, Skarmory has done its job. It doesn't need to do anything else. It denied the value. Now, there's also a risk versus reward aspect to this, of course. Say you take Volcarona here. If it's Terra Ground or Terra Electric, Thunder Wave is not going to be a very good stop to it. But if you have Thunder Wave plus something that can cover Electric and Ground Volcarona very well, then obviously having both is fine. You can see in Terra Preview what the Terra type is going to be. You can take that into account when making your play. So in that sense, making sure that your reward for the play always outweighs the risk is a fairly obvious thing to consider here. So if your only option to deal with Volcarona is Thunder Wave, then you run a massive risk, which should be covered. So there's also general archetypes in Terramons, like I mentioned before, that can kind of be checked by similar type of Pokemon. For example, King Gambit, Ursaluna, Iron Hands are all like bulkier setup Pokemon. A good way to stop any of those is Encore. If they want to set up, they can get Encored. Mental Herb is like the one thing they can do against it, but even then, that's a one-time buffer. If they then have to click a certain move that you can live, then you can Encore them again into that move, and then you can go out into a Pokemon that can punish them for locking that move, essentially. And now for faster Pokemon, you do generally always have priority as an option to deal with those. You can use like resist berries to make sure that whatever weakness they try and target, they can't target it too easily. They can get lured, stuff like that. Now, the other thing to consider is, and it's something to consider just in general while prepping, try and establish what your win conditions are before the game. So, for example, if your win condition is trying to clean with Weavile, make sure you know what percentages you need mods to be at for your Weavile to clean. While the opposite is also true. If the opponent has a Weavile, know what percentages your mons die to Weavile at, so that you can make sure to keep mons that you need for other Pokemon out of that percentage for Weavile. So, for example, take an Iron Hands. Let's say Iron Hands needs to be at 30% for Weavile to kill with Icicle Crash. If you need that Iron Hands to check a problematic Pokemon such as Urshifu, for example, letting the Iron Hands get the 30% is likely not very great. But if it kills the Urshifu and then gets 30%, it's likely more fine. If you need like a certain Weavile check or a certain different mon to check both Weavile and something else, and then obviously becomes more difficult. But knowing what makes you lose before the game is very important in this regard, especially regarding Terra. So, for example, let's take Volcarona as another example. If you know that your check to Volcarona is going to have to be a Toxapex clicking Haze, and you know if it's Terra Electric or Terra Ground with like sub or safeguard for Toxic, I'm going to be in a ton of trouble, then you should already try and prepare for a scenario where that is going to happen. And how do you not lose when that scenario happens? So, the last bit I want to go over is deducing Tera-types in game. And this is an example from a game that I played. So this Dragonite here has the moves Dragonite, Ironhead, Extreme Speed, and Earthquake, while my Excalibur can Terra into any type, and there's no Terra preview. So to understand what the best Terra type is, let's go over what I would do to look at what Terra type this Excalibur could be. So Ironhead, Extreme Speed, and Earthquake are potential offensive moves. Ironhead is resisted by Steel, which, in my opinion, is not a type that Excalibur would realistically want to Terra into this in this matchup. There's a Sandy Shocks, there's an Annihilate, there's a Great Tusk. It gets resisted by Water, which I think is a type that Excalibur could potentially Terra into, as it resists both Steel moves from Tinkaton. Player of is not that strong, so obviously won't take a lot of damage from that. And it also gives it a good defensive typing versus Slowbro, which it can then potentially set up on. So Water is, in my opinion, a possibility here. Electric, I think, is another possibility here. Tinkaton is, again, resisted with its Steel move versus Excalibur if it's electric. It helps it break through Slowbro. It's only weak to Great Tusk, which Ice move obviously covers, and Sandy Shocks, again, which Ice move does cover after setup. So electric is very likely here, in my opinion. Now, extreme speed, uh, is Ghost a likely Terra? I think it can happen. I don't think it's very likely, personally, but I do think it is a possibility. Like I said, Steel is not very likely. I don't think Rock is very likely. It doesn't really do anything, suffers a lot of the same issues as Steel does, in my opinion. So, extreme speed is a decent click compared to Ironhead, in my opinion, already. Because water is a likely type, electric is a likely type. So Ironhead is kind of ruled out already over extreme speed. Then I want to look at Earthquake. Bug is not a very likely Terra type, in my opinion, in this matchup. It does help with Slowbro. It does nothing versus Tinkaton. Does not help with the Tinkaton whatsoever. Uh, it also makes you slightly weaker to Glamora, which I don't think is the biggest deal, but it is something to keep in mind. Grass, again, it helps with the Slowbro, but it does not do anything against Tinkaton. It makes you weaker against Glamora. It makes you weaker against Scarfmeowscarada with U-turn. In general, I don't think Grass is very likely. And then Flying as the last one, which I think is more likely, but it doesn't really do anything to try and get through the Excalibur checks in Slowbro and Tinkaton. So I don't see any real reason for this Excalibur to be flying other than to try and resist Annihilate and Great Tusk. But then again, it is still weak against Glamora. It's still weak against Sandy Shocks, which isn't the biggest deal. Can still get Thunder Punch by Meowscarada. So overall, I don't love uh, Bug, Grass, or Flying, which makes Earthquake actually a very viable click. If you're really scared of Ice Shard, I think you always click Extreme Speed. Because like I said, I don't think that Extreme Speed is a particularly bad click here. But I do think Ironhead is a bad click here, due to Water and Electric being good Tera types here. Now, if you just look at this matchup as is and assume I can be any Tera type, yeah, Ironhead looks like the correct click. Extreme Speed does the least amount of damage, just across the board, because it has no it only has resistances. It's not super effective against anything. Ironhead is currently super effective against me, so if I choose not to Terra, Ironhead will be super effective. And Earthquake can do more damage than Ironhead, but Ironhead also has the flinch chance, so you could potentially get another hit off. However, you know that I'm not going to be one of the 18 types. You already have an idea of what types I could be, so you should keep that in mind while making moves like this. In the game itself, Darkrai went for Ironhead as I Terra Electric, did pretty much no damage, and then his Dragonite died. He could have clicked V-Speed and actually gotten relatively sizable chunk of damage off, uh, or he could have clicked Earthquake and just straight up killed my Max Caliber. But I had to make that call because I can't risk him being Dragonfall or Outrage or something like that, obviously. So I'd want to highlight that real quick for potential leagues where you might play that do not use Terra Preview. That's just something I want to go over. That was pretty much the entire lecture. If there's any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or feel free to ask them at this point, as I've pretty much said what I wanted to say.
I don't have a question, but that was very informative. Thank you, Luxanse.
You are welcome. So if there's no further questions, then that was the lecture pretty much. I hope
Thank you to
you all enjoyed it. So
Yeah, good stuff.
if you guys are vibing with this, if you guys enjoyed it, if you guys want to see more of this, we can always have Luxanse or maybe even other mod members or even just guests. Like maybe we can have Luppy on from FPL or some shit like that on here to give lectures on other stuff that you guys might want to know about. Because I know a lot of people here just want to get better with the game, and so having people like Lux, Sam, even sometimes don't tell them I said that. Have people like that who you're able to get information from can always be helpful. So if you guys want this to continue, just let us know.